G'day, I'm Jan Wasitsky and I'm here in the Castlemaine Art Gallery and Museum, and we're gathered to talk about the monster meeting, and with me is David Bannear. David Bannear is an archaeologist, and for all his life he's been fascinated with the idea that the past is with us still. Welcome. Can we begin with you telling us about how you came to be in this place and your connection with the history of this area we live in, Castlemaine, Mount Alexander and the old goldfields, Judjarung country around us?
Well, I suppose I began connected to this country when I got my first job here, which must have been 20 years ago, when I was employed by the government to come and do an archaeological survey of all the mining relics around Castlemaine. And Robin and I lived here, my partner, and then I moved away to do other work in Tasmania, and then got another contract to come back and do more of it, and so I've been here ever since, 22 years now.
And your feeling for the local landscape and history, has that come since you've been here, or did you have connections before that?
No, I think the reason I feel like I feel is what I am. So from a very early age I was always believed in history in the past, and I always believed that nothing is forgotten. So no, I suppose I live with the ghosts of things, and I really like that idea. And when I came to Castlemaine, it's not that this area is any different really to other areas of Australia about that feeling, but what I really like about this place is that the history belongs to everybody. I in South Australia grew up in a small rural town where the history just belonged to the people who lived there. And if you were a newcomer to that, you were excluded from that history because you didn't belong there. Where you come to the gold rush country in central Victoria, the story actually belongs to everybody, so it includes everybody. So I find it very comfortable living here because I can be part of the history even though I wasn't born here.
And we've got a landscape around here with this story on it. It's quite different to the other big gold rush cities nearby, Ballarat and Bendigo.
Yeah, well, the difference between the Mount Alexander field, the Castlemaine field and Ballarat and Bendigo is that they were all good gold rush country and they had rushes to them, but then both Ballarat and Bendigo developed very sophisticated underground mining, deep lead at Ballarat and quartz mining at Bendigo, so huge cities went over their gold rush landscapes. Where at Castlemaine, by a quirk of nature, it was very rich. 5 or 6 million ounces of gold we covered from the gold rush period, but after that the underground mines weren't that rich, and so the landscape of the diggings was left more or less as it is today, and no city went over it. So if we were at Bendigo, if we drove out into the diggings now into the forest, that would be the same as driving out to Golden Square in Bendigo. So where they have suburbs, we still have the bush.
So their alluvial diggings have just been covered up by the towns and the cities that have been built.
There's no traces of any of that form of mining, both in Ballarat or Bendigo, whereas Castlemaine and around Chute and Friarstown and Guildford, you still have this landscape of the gold rush. It's been, 150 years has passed. Nature has come back, but within the trees and on the ground you can see the remnants of the gold rush. And I strongly believe, and others do, that there's no other landscape like this in the world. In California, which they had the first gold rush in 1848-49, most of their gold rush landscape was obliterated by large-scale hydraulic sluicing afterwards, and the same occurred in New Zealand. Whereas in here, we still have the digger holes and the digger huts, and where people lived and where people worked and all that. We still have their small cemeteries, so it's quite a unique landscape.
Can you read it like Braille?
Well, I can. I can. I don't know if others can. I spent 20 years wandering around and talking to the old timers and showing what this form of mining would have produced, because that's what fascinates me. So I take lots of heritage walks out in the bush and all that, and so I can show people what it looks like, and then they know. But I think until you're shown, it is difficult to understand what something simple may have a very complex meaning around it. I go back to the idea of the landscape that is all through here. Like, this goldfield here is 50 kilometres long and 10 kilometres wide, and In every gully there's the remnants of where the diggers lived and where the diggers worked and and sometimes where they died.
Talking about the impact of the 1850s gold rushes on Victoria and Australia, once in the past you said to me that the gold rush has changed the world from being a vertical world to a more horizontal world. And those two big concepts, upon first hearing, I wasn't sure what you meant. Can you talk about that change, the vertical to the horizontal?
Well, the change from vertical to horizontal is like if you were in 19th century England and Europe, you lived in a very vertical society. You know. When the
What does that mean, though?
Well, there was people up the top and you were down the bottom, and there wasn't much movement. You couldn't go. You know, it didn't flatten out. Why it became horizontal is when they came here, the government, in their wisdom, gave the right to everybody to mine for gold by, you pay 30 shillings a month, you can have your 8 foot by 8 foot claim, and you can have the gold. So they gave the rights to everybody, you know? And that meant everybody was levelled out. And if you read about in their diaries, there's two forms of diaries. There's the diaries of people who first came here and they saw this event that they'd never seen anything like it ever before, and then they wrote about it after with sadness that was all over. But when they first wrote about it, they just talked about how when they came here they were this, and after 3 days they were that. Everybody was the same. Everybody was covered with mud. Everybody wore the same sort of coloured shirts. Everybody spoke the same language, gold and all that sort of stuff. Didn't matter if you came from a privileged family or you were an ex-convict, you were the same. And so gold levelled the society out, and it had some very profound effects, and I think it still shapes Victoria today. I'm firmly convinced that in these gold rush towns you're more easily to accommodate new migrant populations than any other part of Australia. And as for the Sudanese and Burundi people in Castlemaine, they've been accepted, and I think that really goes back to the days of the gold rush.
In the gold rush, could you have come here and been anybody you wanted to be?
Oh, I think in the 19th century, if you were brave enough, that was quite possible. Like, I think a lot of them probably changed their names and reinvented themselves, yeah. I think some probably changed their names more than once and all that. It probably was a society that we probably would like, but we probably don't want to be. But I think that, I think above all they were brave and they were young. Like we live in a population now where there are more old people than young people, but in the gold rush there would have been far more younger people. And I'm talking people from 17 to 25, and there would have been over that age. So you're living in a population of what we would almost call teenagers. So, they would have behaved like teenagers, I suspect, and did things that we were probably as older people would say, oh, you shouldn't be doing that. But I think but they were particularly brave to come from one side of the world to the other and take on a new land.
It's interesting that the Jara people, the Judgerung people who preceded all of the gold diggers, been here for thousands of years, they didn't value the gold at all. They called it kara kara, but to them it had no value. Is that simply because they didn't use a symbolic currency as such?
Well, the Aboriginal attitude to gold, I think, goes in a few directions. One, like Aboriginal people were probably the first affluent society in the world. When I mean by affluent society in the world, then the resources are available to everybody. So in a sense that the great difference between Aboriginal people when the gold seekers came, that the gold seekers came from a world where it wasn't an affluent society. You needed money to buy goods and all that sort of stuff. The resources weren't available to everybody. So there was a fundamental difference in that. And, the conflict between the Jarrah people, the Dja-Dja-Wurrung speaking people, with the squatters is the same. Like, Aboriginal people naturally thought that these sheep belonged to them, because all the resources of the land belonged to them. They looked after the land. they used the land, but you know, it was truly the first world's affluent society, and that's a great difference. And here comes this horde of people from the other side of the world whose whole existence required on getting money. You know, and I always talk to people when I take them out the bush. The whole concept of it is really quite bizarre when you think that all these people flocked here. You know, 200,000 people in 18 months, and men, women, and children, and they dug up the gold and sent it back to ships to England to be buried again. It wasn't used for anything. Just dug it up and buried it again. Like it's quite a, I don't know, quite strange. And you know, I could see that how Aboriginal people could, you know, that was not in their universe because all resources belong to everybody.
Earlier on you said that the government gave people the opportunity and the permission via the gold licence to dig for gold, and they had offered a reward for people to dig for gold, and this helped give people the opportunity to look upon their lives with new hope. But the government really wasn't intending them to rise in the world. That wasn't their motivation, was it?
No. It's interesting, like prior to July 1851 in Victoria and earlier in New South Wales, you know, it was illegal to mine for gold. Like you know, we had the concept of raw minerals, and therefore, if you found gold, you could be put in jail. It was a criminal offence to mine and look for gold. And then in New South Wales, well, I think the world had already experienced what a gold rush was in California, and so when the Australians had gone to there, came back, they knew what the consequences of gold rush would be, and so that's how I think the New South Wales government moved to the gold licence system first, because they certainly they wanted to be able to control it in a way. So I think it was about control and it was about administration. You can imagine, like every mile, once they got off the boat in, you know, Melbourne, they were still law-abiding, come up the Alexander Road, and they got to Sawpit Gully, which was Elphinstone, which is about down the road a bit, and as soon as you got there you had to have a gold licence. Doesn't matter if you were a doctor or a dentist or a gold miner, you had to have a gold licence and you had to carry it with you, and if a policeman came up and demanded to show your licence, you had to show it. And if you didn't have it on you, you were arrested and imprisoned and fined £5.
And the copper got half of that £5.
Yeah, they were bounty hunters. And so you imagine these young people, full of beans, most of them honest. As soon as they get to Sawpit Gully, Elphinstone, everybody is seen as a criminal. And that's a pretty harsh system and you can see why they felt really passionate about their rights.
What about community builders? What sort of... You've mentioned to me in the past that there was the people, they were young and they were community builders, and that's what we've inherited from them, places like this where we live.
I think seeing the gold rush people as community builders really come from the fact that it was a migration-based gold mine and that women came with them. Like if you look at the great difference between the first gold rush to California, which was mainly male orientated, and it certainly wasn't a migration. This one was. This was a migration. Men, women and children come here. And I think initially the great community builders are the women. You just have to read the diaries of some of the women, and they're the first ones who start the schools and all this sort of stuff, the national schools and all that. Men came along. So I think it was the nature of the gold rush being having women along that made it. They were the great community builders. I think it's just been the men. They just would have got drunk and fought and killed one another and had a good time. They may have became community builders afterwards, but I think the first community builders were the women.
How many women were here then on the gold rush?
Well, I don't know. That's a good question. I know at the beginning there wasn't, and when the first ones came, they were seen as quite stunners and all that in the diaries. But shortly after, I think there were families came because they talk about the deaths of the children and the first national schools. So I don't know, but I'd say they would have been a small percentage, but again, they would have been really brave and capable people. Yeah, like you don't get on a boat in England and come all the way to Australia and do this without having something going for you. And I think that people came here, like I know others have said it, and I think Western Base says it too, that they were a very gifted generation. You know, we were very lucky they were the ones that came because they were literate. They came out of England. They were in the middle class mainly. There was this all through Europe at the same time. There's the idea of moving towards democracy, having a fair go, and when they got here, they did, and you know, they created extraordinary communities. When you think like places like Castlemaine and Bendigo and Ballarat went from just tents to cities within 15 years, like instant cities. It's pretty extraordinary what they did.
Whereas the cities of Europe would have grown from villages into that state over a longer period of time, much longer.
Yeah, and been rebuilt. There were some there were a couple of places in England, I think, got big because of the Industrial Revolution and all that, and completely transformed themselves. But in Australia and in California, had these things like they call instant cities, where you know nothing existed, and 15 years later, the cities like you'd find in Europe. Quite extraordinary.
And in Bendigo with the stock exchange.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and you know, when you think, you know, the first railways come here, and after a decade after the gold rush, and when you think railways had just, you know, only been for 20 or 30 years in England, so we're having this very sophisticated forms of transport and the telegraph and all sorts of things come instantly upon this place. And the other thing, and this comes from my upbringing in South Australia, where the town I got, or the district I lived in, never got its hospital until after the Second World War. And we, you know, the Castlemaine Hospital and the Maryborough one, they were up by the end of the 1860s. Here you have communities with hospitals, quite extraordinary. Market buildings, libraries, railway stations, gas works, all in the blink of an eye.
The monster meeting took place on the 15th of December 1851 in response to Governor Latrobe doubling the gold licence. What's your take on the monster meeting? What does it mean? What have we got to learn from it?
Who knows what really happened at the monster meeting? Like, you know, we have speeches written in the newspapers, but how they wrote those speeches down, I don't know. But anyway, but they are fine speeches. But what I really like about it is how the Argus responded to it afterwards, where they likened to recently there'd been published in Europe Frankenstein, a new novel, and the Argus talks about the idea that Latrobe, the authorities, the administrators, had created this Frankenstein that they actually had given name to the diggers. That prior to the monster meeting, I think this is the fundamental point of the monster meeting, that, you know, you can say it's leading towards democracy, but it was like when you think you're talking about the gold, you know, the first gold was found at Bannear and then Ballarat. Now you're talking about, this is 3 or 4 months we're talking about in the history of, and you have all these people milling around, the authorities trying to work out what to do, they don't quite know what they're doing really. And so they were still individuals, that's what I think. And then when the monster meeting comes, the Argus talks about that what the authorities have done is given the diggers this shape of this being. And they were going to be haunted by it forever after. So they created the diggers. The monster meeting created the idea of this immovable force of diggers, which led in the end to democracy in the form of the miners' right and Eureka. And if you hadn't had the monster meeting, they would still have been shapeless. So it shaped them into this thing called the diggers, this massive men and women who are willing to come together and fight for this. So I think it's a really interesting idea.
There was a few ideas expressed at the monster meeting in the speeches, as reported in the Argus. That, is this the sorts of things you're talking about? Ideas that we are going to have a government that's the servant of the people. This is the first real opportunity for ordinary working people, us here now, to make good for ourselves. There's strong ideas in there that we're not going to use violence unless we have to. These sorts of ideas, is this part of your sense of it, that they suddenly came all together at the monster meeting? They'd been scattered about the land?
I don't know. I think it. Yeah, I know that there were ideas expressed at the monster meeting, but I think those ideas, in a sense, had already crystallised in the shape of the idea how society. As soon as you got on the gold diggings, you're all the same. You're covered in mud. They spoke the same language. Didn't matter if you came from Spain or England. Like somehow they communicated and spoke the same language of gold, and they all looked the same. They all great dirt, and they shared this common experience. And I think that's what united them. And I think that at the monster meeting, that's where they finally gave themselves a name and an identity, that all these things that they'd already experienced, like the ones that were assembled there, they'd been on the diggings, so they were levelled out. They were talking the language of the gold diggers. But by Latrobe, by forcing them to gather, gave them this identity that that went forward and ultimately led to democracy. And I think if it hadn't been for Latrobe doing that, then it may never have happened.
What about a spirit that was born at that time?
I think the spirit's hope, like we all hope that it'd be a better world, and I think that, I don't know what it must be like. Like we live in this very privileged country and all that, to be a refugee and feel that you had to leave your own country forever and to come to the other side of the world to mine for gold, like do something you'd never done before, be part of something you'd never done before. I think they were extremely brave, and I think above all it was hope, and like they won the day.
And Australian identity?
Yeah, I think Australian identity comes from that. I think the idea that that corruption isn't proper, like we shouldn't allow corruption to occur, that it's not. And I think that by and large, even though things happen in the modern world that probably are a bit corrupt, ultimately I think we're a fair country as a result of it. And I just see how accepting these gold rush towns are of new people coming in, including at Castlemaine, and you see how perhaps in other places of Australia they're not so accepting of refugees. And I think encouraged me to think that the gold rushes were one of the most important nation-shaping events we ever had.
Are there links between the democracy the diggers were fighting and wishing for here and what was going on in Europe, especially in the preceding few years?
I think so. I think that the great link between what this gold rush was and what was happening in England and Europe, and I think in Canada and other places in the world, was that as you educate people, as the middle class become more educated, then they begin to see the world should be a fairer place for everybody. And in England there was a Charterist movement, and they espouse these ideas of democracy. If we pay taxes, we should get a fair go for it. No taxation without representation was behind it in America. And when they got here, they found the same structure was trying to be imposed upon them. That you'll be taxed, you'll pay 30 shillings a week for a bit of land 8 foot by 8 foot. You won't have any rights. We won't even protect you. In fact, we'll beat you up and burn your tents down. Won't give you any good roads to get up here, but you do what you're told. And it's not what I've said, but others have said that it's the diggers, and you've got to see this if you see it in different ways. Like the diggers thought they were free, right? They got here and they were being constrained. And they were actually unpaid labour for the Bank of England, because if you look at it, everything they dug up went back to England. So they thought they were free, they were working for the Bank of England. And when the authorities became too stringent in what they wanted to do, they just said, this is enough, we've had enough of this. And luckily they won the day, and I think Australia has benefited from ever since.
Was it only through the Chartists that they brought ideas of democracy, or was it from the French Revolution of 1848?
No, it's probably, and there were things happening in Canada as well that were, and they were quite violent things, and probably more people died.
And there was people dying in Italy, Austria, Germany, Prague, for the same idea.
For the same idea, and it comes from, as you educate, as people become more literate, they begin to understand the world and think beyond themselves. But I think here, what really, really captured it was a migration gold rush. So when it all happened, you have men, women, and children. You have families, and I think it was extraordinary times. And I sometimes wish I'd been there, but I don't know. I probably would have died young. I think,
So you think they were extraordinary times because it progressed into?
No, I think it was extraordinary because it was done by young people. I think the times were extraordinary because it was done by young people. Like today, if students at uni protest and all that, older people say, just the young having a go. But this gold rush was all young people. If you're in their 30s and 40s, you're an old man. So most of them are under 20. And they were nation builders. It's quite an extraordinary thing. We dismiss the young as being, you don't know, you don't have this experiences. But those gold seekers, they were young. And they had a go and they were brave. And they stood for things that, these days we just say, they're just young and, we know everything. But, being 60, you look back and think, God, what do they know at the age of 20? But these people are 20. That's what I think is the extraordinary thing. And it's interesting when we do our reenactments of these events. It's people like me, grey-haired with beards and all that. Not 20-year-olds. Would we allow 20-year-olds to represent the gold rush? But they were. Anyway, just an idea. It was their war. I had never fought in a war, but you hear when people fight in wars, the chains forever, and these young people were. When they became old men, they were full of sadness because those days of excitement they'd never feel again. They would never feel the gold. All the gold went back to the Bank of England. They didn't ever hold a hunk of gold in their hand again. So imagine how they felt, and you can see why they were sad. And when they talked about the landscape, they talked about this sadness, this dismal landscape that's got no people in it, just ghosts. Because it just happened so quickly and it was all over. And then they were kind of old. Not young anymore.